What is the sound of one hand clapping? This is something you've heard before, right? What is the sound of one hand clapping? What does this mean? How can you possibly understand or interpret this question? They said a lot of obvious responses, probably. I get people trying to clap with one hand. Or that it doesn't make sense, which is certainly true. But what do you do with it? And how do you know if you've gotten the answer right? What is the sound of one hand clapping is a koan. And a koan is, from the word meaning public question in Zen, a very common practice, especially in Rinzai Zen, given to beginners. And what is the sound of one hand clapping is one of the first ones that's traditionally given. And this is to help students somehow. And you meet with a master in Dokusan, and he'll query you again, what's going on? What is the sound of one hand clapping? Do you have an answer? And you try, and generally it doesn't work. And so you come back later on, maybe, and you try again. How do you know if you get it right? And what could possibly be the use of this kind of question? Because obviously this isn't the only one of this kind. If you've taken a look at the Mumon-kan, the Gateless Gate, or the Blue Cliff Record, or any of a number of other collections of these sorts of puzzles, then you're familiar with the general character of them. They're all very much the same sort of story. You'll have some sort of build-up and a climax that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, generally. An illogical, non-rational puzzle, something that just flies in the face of reason. Like the solution to Nansen's cat, Joshi walks in and puts his sandals on his head, and that's the correct answer at that time. Putting his sandals on his head and walking out. Or kicking over a pitcher of water. Or sometimes just answering straight out. Just calling things as they are. It's very mysterious. And if it's something that you're not well acquainted with, and it's certainly not part of the tradition that we're accustomed to in the United States, in the West, then it just seems outright strange and maybe even some kind of, laughably random thing that people do in Zen. And while there's generally a sense of, well, how good is your Zen? What is your Zen like for this? And people will, either say or do random things to mimic what it is the monks do. Somehow the Zen masters can tell the difference. That's what I would propose to you. And how can they tell a difference? How could you possibly know if somebody's gotten this right? I mean, at what time is the correct answer to the question kicking over a water pitcher, or putting your sandals on your head? In what conceivable universe could that make sense? And that's really the question that we have to figure out in trying to understand Zen. How do these non-rational puzzles and how do the non-rational statements that you see make any sense at all? How can we make sense of something that's either an outright contradiction or just total nonsense? Something that either way doesn't appeal to us logically. It does not invoke the logical mind, or at least the logical mind is powerless in trying to handle these sorts of questions because there's no logic or reason in it. And that's really the key, I think. You see, Zen grew out of China originally in Buddhist history. The story goes that the Bodhidharma went to China in 526, and shortly thereafter, Chan arose as a sect. Now, Chan is just the word for meditation, and the Zen is the Japanese version of that same word, Kwan in Korean and whatnot. They derive from the Sanskrit and Pali words from meditation, jhana. So Zen itself just means meditation. And in general, you'll see that Zen does not focus as much on the, if there is even any sense of doctrine, even any hint of it. There's none of that. There's no reverence or respect for the Buddha necessarily. In fact, one of the popular sayings in Zen is, if you see the Buddha on the street, kill him. And this may sound like just a a really odd or maybe even horrific thing. I mean, if you think about this in the context of another religion, to take the most sacred figure and say, if you ever see him, kill him, it just seems like heresy or something that's, blasphemous or outright, at least just offensive for no reason or problematic. But this comes from within the tradition. So what could they possibly be talking about? Well, I think the answer really is very simple. The Buddha wanted to avoid deification. And part of avoiding deification is to avoid becoming something more than human and avoid becoming something sacred. The Buddha maintained that he was human, that his learning and understanding, his enlightenment was very human. It was something that anyone could do. And so in no sense special in that way. It was not something that needed to be praised. Now, it may naturally be respected and sought after, but it doesn't need to be praised. It doesn't need to be worshipped. That's not the sense in Buddhism. So Zen arose in China, and it makes a good deal more sense, I think, how it is that Zen came about when you take a look at Taoism, which we're going to be doing next time, because Taoism was already in China as a well-established tradition, and Buddhism moves into China, encounters Taoism, and is right at home, essentially. If you read the Tao Te Ching, this could very easily be a Buddhist text in many ways. So I don't think it's hard at all to imagine how it is that Buddhism naturally slipped into China and had no problem assimilating with the current religions of that day. Now, one of my friends, when I was in Tallahassee at Florida State, was a Buddhist monk for a couple of years in a monastery in Thailand. And in that monastery, they basically entirely eschewed learning. And the thought was, in a very traditionally Zen approach, meditation is what's going to get you there. So time spent learning would be better spent on your cushion. So you can try to intellectually understand this thing all day long, and even if you get somewhere, ultimately the meditation is what's really going to count. And so there was a heavy reliance on and belief in the effectiveness of meditation in that tradition, in that particular monastery. And that certainly has its uses. Now, this friend was in Tallahassee as a graduate student in religion, so obviously not doing away with learning was not something that he that appealed to him greatly for the rest of his life, but nevertheless is something of a valuable experience. There's another story of a man who went to Japan to become a Zen monk and stayed there for a couple of years. And after he had come back to the United States, someone asked him, was the time well spent? Is there anything different about you now? And he said, actually, I'm the exact same as I was before, and life is the same as it was for me before, except that I wake up every morning present to what's going on and happy to be alive, pleased and content in each passing moment. But my life is exactly the same. So in other words, the accidents and the eccentricities of life were the same. The events were the same, but the way that he approached it and the way that he experienced it was fundamentally different. So that is very much the nature of Zen, and that's the sense in which someone can easily say that once you get to enlightenment, you realize that you were there the entire time. So it's not a moving to a different plane or a different, there's nothing supernatural here that is referred to. It's simply, the same existence, only better, right? Nothing can be said too much about that, of course, so I won't dwell on it. But suffice to say, we have a number of interesting stories to play on the koan bit in the nonsensical or contradictory nature of Zen teaching more. There's another story of a monk who was in a monastery for several years and was very serious about learning and very serious about meditating and understanding Buddhism. And he kept asking the abbot and going to him over and over again, please tell me, please answer these questions, please help me. I really want to learn. And the abbot kept blowing him off and no, we'll talk, later. We'll do this later. Just on and on and on for a period of years. And obviously this is someone who's very serious. Otherwise they probably wouldn't have stuck around for so long. And one day he comes just like he normally did and asks the abbot, please, help me. I want to understand these things and I've got some questions for you, et cetera, et cetera. And it said that the abbot gave him a good swift kick and knocked him over the railing down from the second story into the bushes below. And as the story goes, he was enlightened before he hit the ground. That is the mystery of the nature of a Zen master. And the idea is that the Zen master knows, or at least does well with providing students with exactly what they need to progress. And exactly what they need is not always exactly what they ask for, obviously, in this case. In fact, it may be something that's shocking and surprising. And that it is something that's shocking and surprising, really, I think once you understand a little more about what's going on, it perhaps will not seem as odd that there are so many random things in Zen. Because when we're talking about progression, when we're talking about what is needed for one person to progress to a higher level of understanding, what we're really talking about is perspective change. And perspective change is not normally accomplished by answering someone's questions and allowing them to stay within their own frame of reference. Perspective change tends to happen by having something disharmonious enter the system, like a good swift kick, or having something that just doesn't make any sense all of a sudden come into the picture, like kicking over the water pitcher, or having someone, put their sandals on their head, or whatever it is, some random event and some random answer or some random question like the koan, some nonsensical thing. It essentially to try and jar your reasoning mind and to jar your perspective into looking at things differently, because we're very much creatures of habit. And if we're allowed to stay in our comfort zone, then we're going to. And what Zen does, and I think what the purpose of the koans really is to break you free from that and try to move you closer to understanding by allowing you the opportunity to change perspective. And that allowance is made by essentially showing you in a forthright manner that your previous way of thinking is not even going to apply. So you're going to have to try something different. And if that's not immediately obvious, then hopefully the master will make it obvious in short order that your logic and reason in attempts to answer the questions or answer the koans isn't going to work. That, I think, explains some of the process. In other words, this is almost a Socratic style tool. It's a pedagogical tool. It's something that's meant for education and the furthering of one's progress in Buddhism. And if you recall from the previous lectures, one doesn't simply learn things as if reading an encyclopedia in Buddhism. And in fact, you cannot state anything in Buddhism at all, anything that is worthwhile, any kind of wisdom. So in other words, you can't talk about Buddhism. All you can do is point to it. And so there's a limit really to logic and analytical understanding, intellectual thinking. And you really have to break out of that and experience things for yourself. And part of experiencing things for yourself, especially if you're aiming towards a new perspective, is jarring you out of the old one and showing you that the old perspective is not going to work. And I think this is very much the sense that we get from reading the commentaries on the koans, especially the modern commentaries. If you're interested in this sort of thing, there's a volume called Straight to the Heart of Zen by Roshi Philip Kapleau, who is American. And the American Zen practitioners, especially those that are from the United States, tend to have a perspective that is, because they have a lot in common with us culturally anyway to begin with, sometimes I think that helps for them to frame Zen in a more compatible way with the perspective that we already have. Now, I'm not saying changing it. I'm just saying being able to phrase it and put things in such a way that it's intelligible to us, that they know what to do perhaps a bit better to help us in that way. I don't know if that's necessarily true across the board, but Kapleau's work is very good. Goldstein's is also very good with respect to explaining Zen and trying specifically, in this case, with Straight to the Heart of Zen, explaining the koans. And this is very much the same kind of thing, that he has to say in that volume. There's a story about Zen succession And you hear about patriarchs in Zen, and essentially these are nothing more than, abbots, enlightened figures. And you pass this via Dharma transmission from one person to the next. And we actually have someone who has received a Dharma transmission here in Atlanta, which is very unusual. And this just happened recently, as in, I believe, 2007. I don't remember exactly when he did it, but Michael Ellison is the person that I'm thinking of, who is the head of the Atlanta Zen Center. Received the Dharma transmission and is now officially a Zen master. But this is the same kind of process that we hear about here with Huining and his process to become the sixth patriarch of Zen. The story is that the old patriarch was preparing to pass the mantle and control of the order to someone else, and it was thought at the time that Shen Shu, who was the head monk, everybody expected him to be the next patriarch, and the master had asked for a verse explaining essentially your perspective on things. What is it that you're doing here in the monastery? How would you describe that? And his verse went as follows. He said, "Our body is the Bodhi tree, and our mind a mirror bright. Carefully we wipe them hour by hour, and let no dust alight." In other words, our body is the Bodhi tree, the symbol of wisdom, the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment. And our mind is like a mirror. And you can only see very clearly in a mirror if the mirror is clean. And so we carefully clean the mirror so that we can see the reflection as clearly as possible. And this is the process of meditation. And while this is an interesting and very practical description of what goes on in a monastery, it's said that Huining, who was not even affiliated, as I recall, not even affiliated with the order, came by and responded to this and wrote this verse and says, "There is no Bodhi tree, nor stand of a mirror bright, since all is emptiness, where can dust alight?" In other words, basically contradicting Shen Shu's verse in every way, and by providing perhaps every possible contradiction and emphasizing shunyata, the void and emptiness, he was chosen as the successor. And the story goes that the abbot went around and said, "Okay, who did this? Who wrote this? Because this is right. This really has the essence. This is what I was looking for." And Huining was selected. All right. Now let's move on to discuss meditation and the practice of meditation. This is a very old practice, and we don't even really know how old. It's such a simple thing in terms of just watching one's mind and trying to gain awareness and build a skill of calming one's mind and being able to watch things as they go by, that we really have to guess at how old this is. It's probably at least 5,000 years old. So we're probably talking about at least 3,000 BC. And I've heard dates with respect to the Jains and early Hindu yogic practice going back this far. So it is possible that meditation is that old. At the very least, it's a simple thing in concept to sit down and try it. It's a simple thing to describe to someone, but it's probably one of the most, if not the most difficult thing to gain skill in. That being said, no one's really good at it when they start, but everyone can do it. And because of that, this, among other things, led the Buddha to say that anyone can reach enlightenment. It's not a matter of intelligence or social status or anything else. Really, it's something that's available to people, and this kind of attainment is available, but it's very difficult. And correspondingly, there's the story, if I haven't mentioned it already, that one shouldn't bother trying to attain to enlightenment and entering a monastery unless one needs enlightenment, like a man with his hair on fire needs a pond in which to dive, because it's just too hard. And so unless it's something that you really need, you're not going to get there. So in that sense, this is one of the reasons that Buddhism doesn't have missionaries. There's no point. There's no point in trying to proselytize someone with this, because if they don't want to understand it, they're not going to understand it. It's that simple. So it's very much a volitional sort of practice and a religion, perhaps. So what is meditation? Well, meditation at its essence is really just watching the mind and watching without differentiating between things, without judging, just watching what's going on, not getting carried away with any particular thought, but just noticing what's happening. And this is a lot harder than it sounds, especially if you haven't tried it. I encourage everyone to just try this for a few minutes. Get into a comfortable position wherever it is that you're sitting, close your eyes, and just watch. Just watch what happens. Watch the thoughts as they go past, and see how long it is before you get carried away and wrapped up in one of the thoughts, and you forget that you were watching. It's probably not going to be very long. One of the ways of realizing just how quickly this can go is by trying to practice Vipassana, and specifically if you're doing counting with your breaths, as in you're trying to watch your breath, and you count on every in-breath, or you count on every out-breath from 1 to 10. You're probably not going to make it all the way to 10 before you get distracted. So it really doesn't take very long. And this is the monkey mind of Zen, the mind that's constantly flying from one concept to the next. And one of the nice images that I've heard for this is that of a dog who's tethered to a stake in the ground. So you have this stake with a chain, and the dog is attached by a collar at the chain. So this is a fairly common thing. I'm sure you're familiar with what this looks like. And if you have a dog that's particularly resistant to this, then they'll run to the edge of the chain, and then they'll run in another direction to see if they can get away from it, and eventually trace the entire circle of the area that they can actually get to while they're tethered. And they may bark and carry on and really pull hard against the chain, but eventually the dog is going to settle down and lose some of his resolve. And he loses some of his resolve, and maybe he walks around instead of running. And maybe he stops barking quite so much, and then looks less energetic, and then finally lays down. That is the process that I think this is a very good analog to the process that a lot of people experience when they're trying to calm their mind in meditation. That at first the mind is like that very energetic tethered dog, that it just flies from one thing to the next, and we have so many thoughts rushing through our heads on a moment-to-moment basis that it's very difficult for us to even watch what's going on because there's so much happening. But eventually, if you keep trying and you keep pulling your mind back just to being aware of what's going on, then eventually your mind will start to settle down. And the longer you persist in this, the more still your mind will become, the stiller your mind will become. And eventually it will be, placid, like a lake. And the other image that's given for this is just that. If you're looking into rough waters, you're not going to be able to see your reflection very well, and you may not even be able to tell that it's you that you're looking at if the water's rough enough. But the more that it calms down, the clearer the image is that you can see in the water. And you still have ripples and whatnot, and so it's still not perfectly clear, but maybe after a while you can tell it's you. Well, if the water is perfectly still and undisturbed, then it produces a mirror-like surface, and you can see yourself as if you were looking in a picture. And this is the idea, and this was the idea behind the verse of Shinshu in the Huining story, that if you still your mind enough, then you eventually get to the point where it is completely still. And if there is any disturbance, then you can watch that disturbance as it arises. You can watch it go through its lifetime, as long as it's going to last, and then you can watch it fall away. And you can do this with sensations as well. And this is the idea in meditation, is to be able to do this. And by doing this, you learn something. And what you learn is a new perspective. And that new perspective is informed by what you've seen. And you're learning how your mind works. This is something that we're largely ignorant to because our minds are, going 100 miles an hour all the time, and we don't bother to try and slow them down. And even if we try and slow them down, quite honestly, if you don't have anyone telling you that, hey, you just need to keep at this, you're probably not even going to believe it's possible, because it seems like the mind is just going on its own and just, running like crazy, and there's very little that you can do about it. But as it turns out, there is something that you can do about it. It just takes some doing. It takes some persistence. And if you are doing this properly and just watching, not judging, and not getting carried away with the various thoughts, or at least when you do, bringing your mind back to simply watching, then you will eventually get to where you're very relaxed and able to watch each thought arise and then pass away. And there's some interesting things that can be learned during that time. And this is the idea behind Vipassana practice. Now, Vipassana is probably the most common style of meditation. It's certainly one of the simplest and most obvious, perhaps. I mean, when you're sitting perfectly still, so you're sitting on your cushion, sitting on the ground, maybe even laying down. It's possible to do that in meditation. It's just a little harder because you might fall asleep. Not that you can't fall asleep when you're sitting up, but if you fall asleep when you're sitting up, you fall over and wake up. So it's a little bit easier not to stay asleep, whereas if you're lying down, you may be there for a while. So the idea in Vipassana is simply to watch your breath. And technically speaking, we're using the breath as a focus. And so what you're doing is you're trying to concentrate. And remember, the word for concentration is samadhi. And so you're building up a skill in concentrating. You're building up a skill in being able to have one-pointed or single-focused concentration on an object. And in this case, it's the breath. Well, why is the breath a good choice? Well, if you're sitting perfectly still, the only motion in your body that is very easy to feel and that is persistent, that it's not going to go away, is your breath. Now, your heartbeat might work as well, but you can't always feel. But the breath, on the other hand, is very present. It's very immediate, and you can sense it. Even when your breath is very, very shallow, you can still feel it. And so it provides a pretty good stimulus. It provides a pretty good focus. And in doing this, hopefully, relaxing enough and going through the progress that I described, then you eventually get to the point where you have single-pointed concentration. You have single-pointed focus on that thing. And at that time, something very strange happens. And that very strange thing that happens is that you're not worried about anything. You're not pressed with any other issues, and you are concentrated on one thing, which means that you're not suffering with anything else. And bliss tends to be the experience there. And you know it when you get there. It's a decisively different thing than the experience up to that point. And this isn't something terribly arcane. I don't know what the time period is that one can expect to do this, but I'm wanting to say, a few weeks of really dedicated, practice. You're doing this a few times a day, maybe for however long, 30 minutes or an hour at a session. You're going to get there. As long as you're doing this properly, as long as you're just watching, then you're going to eventually get there. And so this is not a, really esoteric experience. And these kind of things are becoming more and more recognized and studied in psychology as well. And we're going to get to that as far as the Western medicine approach to meditation, which has recently been overwhelmingly positive. So in getting to that point and noticing things about your mind, the idea is that you'll gain insights into how it is that your mind works. You'll gain insights into your perspective and personality and the way that the world appears to you, and then hopefully eventually the way that the world is and what the nature of yourself and consciousness is, specifically that there is none. And Vipassana meditation is not infrequently called insight meditation for this reason. And part of the progression in terms of the kind of insights that are spoken of with respect to this, and Jung calls these prescribed insights, which is very interesting. The first is probably my thoughts arise at random. This is one of the things that you notice if you are watching and you are just watching for a long time and you don't get wrapped up in a thought. When you get wrapped up in a thought, you try to control them and you try to direct them and you get tied to whatever's going on. But when you're not trying to control things and you're just watching for a long enough period of time, you're going to notice all kinds of topics arising to you. You're going to notice all kinds of thoughts coming about. And it seems to be just completely at random. And how random that is can be a very impressive thing. The second, or at least perhaps further than that, is I'm not in control of my own thoughts. Well, if my thoughts are arising at random, then maybe I'm not even in control of what's going on. And so we'd like to think of ourselves as being in control of our minds and being in control of the way that we think. But I'm not sure that's really a very representative of what actually goes on. And a little bit of a smattering of neurophysiology, neuropsychology, and psychology will show you that there's plenty going on in the mind that we're not conscious of. And at any given time, there are simply things that are brought to our awareness, and it's possible for us to be aware of certain things. But the overwhelming majority of the information that's processed and what goes on is not conscious, is not open to conscious awareness, and certainly not open to conscious control. So this is an interesting statement, and very much in line with the same kind of thing that the same direction that we seem to be headed in Western psychology. Further, there's no continuity to my thoughts, which is interesting and seems to remove a sense of either purpose or drive, or you start seeing a sort of breakdown in cohesion with respect to one's individuality and personality. And eventually you get to the point, as it says next, if you're following along in the PowerPoint, there is no self. Because ultimately our notion of self is based upon the perceived continuity from one moment to the next. And if you don't find a self when you're sitting there looking at your thoughts, then where else could it be? And that's really kind of the idea here is, what's going on between thoughts? Well, nothing. And isn't that interesting? That sort of thing. And then eventually there is no consciousness, but we're talking about the upper realms of the jhanas, or the concentrated, the sort of markers for concentration, which is recognized as one of the higher states of consciousness, perhaps equivalent to getting to nirvana. Recognize again that this is, as we mentioned previously with respect to Kabbalah and other systems, the Kundalini system makes this particularly explicit, but you have these different stages of consciousness, these different stages of awareness moving up from through the body, generally up the spine is the way that this is spoken of. If you look at the caduceus, and the caduceus, of course, is the snakes, the two snakes that are intertwined around the staff with wings. For medicine, the caduceus is from this, is an image to describe this sort of progression. And each time the snake's bodies meet, that's another level. And so by the time you get to the very top level, that's, here's your wings, here's the top portion of it, the lotus on top of the head, perhaps in the Kundalini system, or Keter and Bina and Keter in Kabbalah, nothingness, that which is closest perhaps to the divine. Now, we've gone through and described a lot of what's going on. I want to backtrack and fill in some details here, because there's a lot more that can be said, and this is something that people just write volumes and volumes on, and there's so much information out there if you're interested in trying to gain skill at meditating. One of the techniques that's recommended, I mentioned counting the breaths. Counting the breaths is good because it makes it a little bit easier to stay interested in what's going on. And part of getting to concentration early on in meditation is focus in terms of interest, and being able to not ignore necessarily, but not be attached to the other passing thoughts that are vying for your attention. And so counting can be good because it gives you something to think about and something to notice. The breath itself, eventually you do away with the counting and you can just look at the breath itself. And if you're looking at all the details and trying to experience all of the details, what does the breath feel like as it comes in through the tips of my nostrils, in my nose, in the back of my throat, filling my chest with air and then back again. If you're noticing all of the various sensations and are interested in trying to notice all of the various sensations, then it makes it much easier to achieve a concentrated state more quickly, because you tend to have fewer distracting thoughts that arise. So that helps, and that's part of the purpose of having a focus for meditation. The focus can be anything. You can use a statue or an image or anything that can be present to the mind as a focus, but something that is constantly changing. A physiological response, especially like breathing, works very, very well. The next technique that I wanted to mention is mental noting. And mental noting is simply noticing what's going on so that you don't get attached to the passing thoughts. So here, you might have, well, I was thinking about my car earlier, or I was thinking about, how long is this going to take, or, who am I sitting next to, or did I already speak with someone today, or, have I done my homework, or whatever it is. When these thoughts arise, the technique of mental noting says just take note of it. Maybe even say something very simple to yourself like, thought. And generally, that will be enough to break the habit of getting carried away with a thought and allow you to maintain that awareness and non-judgmental awareness and non-attached awareness. And then you'll notice, curiously, if you do this enough, and this is really an interesting thing, that you don't have to get carried away with a thought, and it will go away. And you could watch it go away, which is a fascinating thing. I mentioned Goldstein earlier. Joseph Goldstein has a book called Insight Meditation, and there's a bit by him here that I think is a particularly good description. He says, perception and concentration arise at every moment, so this is nothing unfamiliar to us. Even when the mind gets lost in thought, we still recognize what it is that we're thinking. But only mindfulness reveals that we are thinking. Because most of the time, we're not really thinking about the fact that we are thinking. We're thinking about something else. And in the practice of mindfulness, the idea is to be aware that we are thinking, perpetually aware that we are thinking, and not carried away thereby by the thoughts that arise. So the idea here is that mindfulness notices the moment-to-moment arising and passing of sense impressions. It's by the practice of mindfulness that we can be aware of the momentariness of phenomena, that we can be aware of what's going on from moment to moment, and that they are ephemeral, and that we do not need to be attached to them. And really what this plays on is emotional habit. And this is part of the healing power of meditation and capacity for psychological change that is positive. And this is something that's been studied more extensively in the past few decades, particularly coming out of Harvard for whatever reason. A lot of medical studies done on meditation to see how effective it is and how it is, by what mechanism, what's going on and what can people change? What is the extent of the mastery that you can gain over your mind? And indeed, what kind of physiological changes can you affect in your body? I mean, as it turns out, being able to increase one's, let's say, skin temperature and slowing digestion is some strange things that can happen. Nevertheless, the process of tumo is related to this. There's a video on that I recommend where people, when you're particularly good at generating this heat, you can actually go out in the cold, wrap yourself in a blanket that's been soaked in ice, basically naked, and dry the blanket. In other words, you'll see steam coming off of the blanket. You can keep your skin temperature high, and that's high enough to dry the blanket, which is interesting. It's interesting that we have that much control because we typically think of shivering as an unconscious, involuntary response. So, continuing on, there's a lot of material on this. So, if you're interested in it, the descriptions, as I mentioned, with Kaplow and Thich Nhat Hanh is another good one for the practice of mindfulness and a very simple approach to the practice of mindfulness. If you're interested in a more academic approach, which is a bit more of what's available in this class with respect to meditation, the history, and the psychological mechanics of it, Suzuki is actually a great author for that source of that kind of information. He's done a lot of very traditional academic work and comparison studies and detailed information on Zen. Now, I mentioned the healing in meditation, the psychologically positive effects. When one is not carried away by the thoughts that arise, and indeed not carried away by the emotions that arise, because we may be accustomed to or prone to some sort of depression or anger or separation, even continually thinking about something that is a problem for us. If you're in meditation and you are watching and you're able to maintain that watching posture when something disturbing comes up to your mind that you would normally worry about, then you'll find that the ensuing emotion and the ensuing emotional train, in other words, the ensuing emotional habit, is not allowed to execute. It's not allowed to continue. And it is possible then to maintain your tranquility and peace, even though something that normally would have disturbed your peace has arisen. And obviously, this is harder with the bigger things. If you just had, a spouse or a child die or something, meditation is going to be very hard because this is a very profoundly impactful thing that disturbs you. And so this really works best with small disturbances, but even, in the beginning. But the point here is that we can eventually, by doing this and breaking the cycle enough times, we can start to get out of the habit of getting carried away with the thoughts and getting carried away with the emotions and allowing the emotional train to basically make us miserable in these different situations. And maintaining, and this is the practice called mindfulness, maintaining mindfulness, in other words, maintaining one's equanimity and watching even when you're not on your cushion, even when you're just out, doing whatever it is that you do in your life. And psychologists have noticed this, that the people tend to carry over that skill and that perspective into the other things that happen in their lives. So when someone insults them or yells at them, or when something happens that would normally be disturbing, if they are able to continue to practice in the same way that they would as if a thought had arisen during meditation, and their skill is sufficiently high for whatever the disturbance is, then they can prevent themselves from being disturbed by it. And this can be done not only with psychologically disturbing things, but also with physical pain. So anyone's reaction, or I should say your reaction to anything, can be affected by this. Now, the more severe the disturbance, including physical pain, the more severe that is, the harder it's going to be. But this is where we get the stories of the monks that are tortured or walk on fire or set themselves on fire or whatever it is, and do not seem to be affected by it. This would presumably be someone with a very high skill in meditation that was able to maintain equanimity regardless of the stimulus that was coming in. Because as I'd mentioned before, but this bears mentioning again, this is sort of a mantra for understanding this aspect of mystical practice and Buddhism in particular, that pain is something that you can't avoid. I mean, you're going to have pain that comes up in your life. I mean, you're going to stub your toe. There's nothing you can do about the experience of pain, but the suffering that ensues is not required. And there is something that you can do about that. And that's what meditation seeks to address. The pain itself, I mean, these kind of things are going to happen, but the suffering is not necessary. And that's what Buddhism seeks to address. And that's what the mystical traditions in general seek to address. And that's what the meditator eventually seeks to deal with, is to be able to carry that practice of mindfulness over to his daily routine and apply it in situations where normally he would be disturbed, hurt, angered, feared, whatever it is, and maintain that equanimity and contented peace and calm. Because this is, when I describe contentedness and serenity and whatnot, we're not talking about being numb. We're talking about, I mean, this is a form of happiness. So, a very pure form of happiness, in fact. So we're talking about maintaining an overwhelmingly positive and healthy psychological state in the face of adversity, essentially. So it's not really hard to imagine that if this is successful at all in any reasonable way, which has been around for 5,000 years and practiced by millions of people, it is now being shown very clearly in study after study to be successful. And a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists are using this technique now with their patients. It's not hard to imagine that it would have a healing effect. In fact, one study that I read said that the effect seems to be almost a universal cure for things, as in it addresses psychological issue in general, that with someone with anxiety, with depression, or whatever the problem is, tends to be helped in some way by this practice. So it's very interesting just how generally this applies to psychological problems. And really what we're talking about here is stress, that it applies to either eustress or distress. In other words, either good stress or bad stress, so either pleasure or pain. Any state of excitation in the mind is subject to this sort of practice and can be made, its effect can be lessened by maintaining mindfulness. Now, of course, the question is, how far can you go with this? Because ultimately, when we're talking about this, it's hard not to talk about enlightenment, and it's hard not to talk about some of the really extreme stories that we get where people are basically tortured and or killed and don't seem affected by it. And that we have to ask the question then naturally, is that realistic? Or is this real? Is this believable that we can attain that much mastery over the mind so that we can do that? And I'll leave that as an open question. There's a very long tradition of this sort of thing, and you hear about it in a lot of different religions. But some of the stories are fantastic sometimes. So is it really believable? Regardless of if it is or not, meditation, and the reason that I wanted to go over it in some detail, this is something that you really probably have not had much of an opportunity to learn about in your academic careers, and it's something that people don't come across very often. In fact, I heard one Eastern commentator remark about this as far as our Western educational system and say that, we do a lot of fact-based learning. We do a lot of learning about the world in general and how things work, the mechanisms and whatnot, but we don't do very much for bettering the person. As in, we don't seem to be too concerned about the person's psychological state and how healthy they are psychologically. There was a study that came out recently, or not recently now, I suppose this is a number of years ago, called Prozac at Princeton, which was a study of antidepressants, obviously, at Princeton. Now, you would think in that area of privilege, presumably financially and intellectually, one should be happier, perhaps. But in fact, if our astute observer here was correct, then we are taking care of the knowledge aspect of academic study, but we're not taking very good care of how psychologically healthy people are. We don't have a lot of advice for that. We don't have a curriculum for it, which is interesting and somewhat unusual.